Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to see you. So a little bit of spring rain, right, to get the flowers and everything and grass growing. And so this is an interesting chapter, chapter 7, about learning to bless those who curse you, and sort of a rhetorical question. How are your enemies today? It's interesting, isn't it, to think about that. That in actuality we all have enemies. I mean, and I guess part of that would be, how do you define enemy, and what does that look like, and what are the kinds of things that make somebody a foe as opposed to a friend would be part of it. And as I was thinking about that, I was remembering back in my own life, times when I had done something good in like a job I was in, but there was somebody else who sort of claimed credit for that. And so enemies may not be those who are physically trying to harm us all the time, although they could be. They also may be people who simply undermine us, that sort of falsify the things we do. They're sort of opponents, and I think that's why it's interesting. The Smith talks a little bit about competitors, like who's competing or competing with us, who's sort of opposing us as opposed to encouraging us. And so if you think about it, a lot of times the New Testament talks about how we should build each other up and encourage each other, but there's a lot of times that we end up tearing each other down and defeating each other. And when we do that, we're moving more into the enemy stance rather than the brother and sister stance of encouraging. So I think in this study it doesn't hurt to sort of get a picture of somebody that you sort of see as an opponent, or somebody who you feel like is a kind of enemy that you're dealing with, and then think about how does this play out for you. And I'm going to give a lot of caveats in this, because I think it's really important for us to realize that loving our enemies does not mean that we put ourselves in places where we are vulnerable or we can get hurt more by them. But it does mean some things for us as we're trying to think about what does it mean to live as kingdom people. So there's a very radical difference in my mind between sort of being vulnerable to our enemies and the whole idea of learning to sort of let go of them and love them and not be controlled by them as well. So we live in this dog-eat-dog world, right? I mean, it's sort of like everything's up for grabs. You don't know how things are going to work. And I remember growing up in Southern California, it's interesting to me that a lot of Smith's language and illustrations in this whole section are what I would say are ideas related to what I grew up in, sort of a gang mentality. And if you think about it, like here in Philadelphia, if one gang does something, like let's say that there's a fight on Saturday night outside of a liquor store in downtown Philadelphia, we oftentimes hear that the other gang came back later and they shot somebody. And then we'll hear that gang went back and shot 3 people. And so one of the things that's interesting that Jesus is revealing here is that this gang mentality, which is basically that you don't get even, you retaliate and do more harm than was done to you, is one of the things that he's trying to nip in the bud. He's trying to say, wait a second, this isn't the way, violence begets violence, and if you keep going down that road, there will never be an end to it. And that's one of the things that he's trying to sort of impose. Now, the question though becomes, okay, well, how do you put an end to the cycle of violence then? I mentioned Southern California. I grew up, and it's sort of comical to me right now to think about, and maybe we were just sort of gang wannabes, but there was some real danger that was involved. I mean, I was in a very highly Anglo and Spanish area, and there were very clear dividing lines between the whites and the Mexicans, those that were Anglo, those that were from Mexico, and we literally didn't go on each other's territory. I mean, even at our high school, there were dividing lines between, and we called ourselves, this is the funny part, the surfers and the lowriders. So the surfers were the white guys who went surfing all the time, and I was one of them, and the lowriders were the Mexicans who had taken their cars and made them very low. But I'll tell you, if I was walking down the street and I saw a lowrider go by, I ran, because more than likely they would stop and beat me up. And so what happened is we hung around in gangs. And a gang, though, sort of loosely, was that basically the more friends you had, the less likely you were to get beat up. But I found myself, even at school, we found ourselves in gang fights. And we realized this cycle. Like at an early age, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, found that this is true. Like, they would stop and they would beat one of us up. We would go find them and we'd beat up more of them. And this was before guns, which was really, now gangs carry guns all the time. The most anybody ever had was a baseball bat or a knife, which was dangerous enough. But that would always happen. So Jesus comes in and he says, okay, this is sort of how the world operates, but my kingdom is going to be different. It's not going to be, do the worst thing to somebody who does something bad to you. It's going to be different than that. But at the same time, we find ourselves as people in this world, we feel like we're disempowered, we're vulnerable, we're not able to, do the things we'd like to do. Sometimes we even feel a little bit exposed, as Smith says. And so the quickest way to try to deal with our own insecurity is that we try to gain power or control. So he gave some interesting examples, like we go to the gym so we can get, some physical strength. We try to build financial security. When we feel, unfairly treated by somebody, we try to counteract that and, maybe get up on them so that we have a sense of being able to take care of ourselves. And, the narrative is if somebody hits you, hit them back harder, is what he says on page 120. And all of that is sort of embedded in this whole idea that if we stand up to those who are bullying us, then then they won't bully us anymore. So, and he gives an example in his own life about one day that he got in the fight with the bully, and and because of that fight, the bully didn't bother him anymore. But the question is, does that really work? Does that really work? The Old Testament has phrases, and this is one of those places, again, I love, the Sermon on the Mount, because Jesus says over and over, he says, you have heard it said of old, blah, 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 but I say to you, and then he says something new. And what he's doing is he's reframing a lot of these different teachings in ways that are full of more grace and truth, which is who he is. He's come to bring grace and truth. Here he says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, you should love your enemies. Do not resist the evil person. And of course, Gandhi has this great phrase in here, right? He says, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, right? But Smith rightfully talked about how this is, in the Old Testament, a law of reciprocity. So what it is it's sort of equalizing things. Now, the reason that that's important, and this is hard for us to understand in our society, because our society and culture is so removed from Old Testament. But the reality was, if somebody hurt me, I would basically just take them out. So, if they, like, let's say that they killed my ox. Well, I would kill all of their livestock. I mean, it wasn't anything like a fairness. It was like total retaliation. If somebody cursed me, I could kill them. If, and basically what happens in the Old Testament is God says, no, wait, that's not the way it's supposed to work. And so there's this interesting laws of fairness that come about that say, okay, if somebody knocks out your tooth, you can knock out their tooth. If somebody pokes out your eye, you can poke out their eye. Now, it sounds really barbaric to us, but in that time, that was actually a new form of justice that people were not used to. The other thing was, you may remember back in the end of the book of Genesis, and when Cain and Abel, and there's the death that occurs, there becomes these places called a city of refuge that spring up. And the city of refuge was a place that somebody could run to if they murdered someone. Now, what would happen is if they got to that place, they could have a trial, but that's a new concept, because before that, if somebody murdered somebody, you just killed them on the spot, or whoever was there would have killed them. So you see, this whole society is really sort of morphing into a more just society, and God's in the middle of that saying, let's make this more fair. Let's talk about justice. let's not just, it's not an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth anymore, but there's going to be a new way of being. So here it is. I'm going to read the verses out of Matthew chapter 5. It's 38 through 48. And just let it, you're going to talk about this today, so just let it sort of, just sort of soak it in. Jesus says, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go a mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you." Okay, so in that we see that he's talked about, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. That's not the way it's going to be. If somebody strikes you, turn the cheek. If someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, hand them also your cloak. If someone wants to force you to go 1 mile, go the extra mile with them. Okay, so we see those things. Now, Smith unpacks those culturally. It talks about why those would make sense to the people in that culture, and you'll get a chance to talk about that in your groups. But he's saying basically, when you live into this kingdom, you're going to do things differently than the way they were done before. Then verse 43 says this: "You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy." Okay, so that makes sense, right? There's an Old Testament, okay, I love my neighbor, but you're my enemy, I hate you. That's why you're my enemy. "But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Okay? So he says, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. That causes us a lot of trouble, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. But then he says this, that you may be sons and daughters of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Now, we dealt with that verse last year in The Good and Beautiful God, too, about how God sort of blesses all people, and the question is, how do they respond to that blessing? But it's not like you're going to be, you're going to torture yourself, but God's not going to torture you if you're doing the wrong things. And so that was part of the point last year. "If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that?" There's an interesting thing, right? So the tax collectors were seen as really sort of the very bottom of, they were the people that you avoided. "And if you greet only your brothers or sisters, what are you doing more than others? Don't even the pagans, the non-believers, do that?" Then he says, "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." That's one of those verses we should edit out of the Bible. I'm just joking. But it's one of those ones that causes us trouble. So, okay, so I get this. Like, all the things I usually do, you're saying not to do, and then you're saying that I need to be perfect. What in the world does that mean? How do I live into that? Smith calls this, and I thought this was interesting, he calls it Christian jiu-jitsu. Did you get a chance to read that? But again, because jiu-jitsu, he says, is really not a way of fighting, it's a way of yielding and learning to use your opponent's strength against them. And I think that is a good sort of way of capturing this idea of what does it mean to love an enemy. Let me see if I can sort of boil it down. He does say this. He says that he's talking more about an inner attitude than a command. And I think that's important for us to understand. In a way, somebody can only be an enemy if we let them be an enemy. And we always have a decision about how much we'll let what they're doing really sort of make us upset. So one of the things that we can do, and I think part of what Jesus is saying here, is that in the midst of these cycles of violence that often take place, in the midst of this, you're my friend and you're my enemy, he says to take a little bit different stance. And part of what he's saying here, which isn't as sort of visible to our eyes, is he's saying, because you live in the kingdom, part of what you're deciding to do is not to buy into that system where when somebody is evil to you, you immediately reciprocate with evil back at them. You're making a choice to sort of stop the violence and all of that right here and not pass it on. Now, part of the reason this is important is because we see lots and lots of examples of this in our society. The gang example is one, but we also see this in families. I mean, it's very sobering how sometimes families that have had violence in them, even though the children maybe have been those that really endured the most of that and say they'll never do it, sometimes they find as they get adults that they're doing the same thing. So one of the things that Jesus does, which is very significant, is that he breaks these modes of being in us. Like, you know, there's another Old Testament saying that says the sins of the fathers will be visited on the sons and daughters. And it's basically saying that whatever you've done before or experienced, that's going to happen in you. And Jesus steps in and says, no, I'm going to break that. Redemption and forgiveness and grace breaks that process so that we actually can become whole new people. Okay? Now, let's back up this a little bit, though, because we have to talk realistically about what do we do with enemies. Like, I totally get this because I have a couple of live enemies right now, and I'll tell you how I classify this. And I don't tend to think of them as enemies, but they act like enemies. But there are people that actually are working hard to sort of undermine me at the things I do, and I find that they try things that don't work for them, but they keep reminding me that they're out to get me, like they're out to get me. And I don't mean to make this sound too heavy, but it's a reality I'm dealing with right now where somebody will say, oh, you know, so-and-so called me the other day to complain about something you were doing. And I'm like, really? But I assured them that wasn't happening. And I'm like, okay, well, they didn't get what they were looking for, but I don't know why they're so upset. And the thing that's funny is I've talked to them about it and, you know, things like that, but that didn't help. So, you know, I have to decide, what am I going to do? So one of the things that's very much a temptation, right, is that, like, I can look at their life and see how they're not doing everything right, so I could do the same thing they're doing. But that's not really helpful. It's not helpful to me. And I think that's part of Jesus' point here, you see, is that stepping into that kind of posture with other people isn't really helpful. So I'll tell you what I've started doing. I've started just praying for them because that's what the Bible says to do. Now, I have to admit, my first prayers weren't that nice. You know, like, God, show them their mistakes. God, you know. But as I've progressed, and I think this is part of the point of prayer, too, is that prayer sort of changes us. But the other thing I've realized, and this is part of Jesus' point here, is that when you realize that God really is the one who has given you everything, who is with you in life, who is your security, who knows that you are doing the best you can, that you can really lean into that no matter what other people are saying about you, and that can become a source of security for you, even in the midst of, you know, others that misunderstand or maybe try to undermine you. And I think that's important. So here he says, and you know, some of the customs were things like if a Roman soldier came up, and the Roman soldiers were hated, if they came up and asked you, if you're Jewish, they asked you to walk a mile, that meant that you actually had to, and you would take all of their luggage or, you know, all their belongings, and you would carry those for a mile. And Jesus says, don't just go 1 mile, go 2 miles. And he's talking about how do you live into this way that sort of surprises others with the fact that you're different than everybody else who's around you. So let me back up again too, and let me just give a little bit of the caveat about, you know, how do we protect ourselves? Because one of the things that Smith is not saying here that's very important is he's not saying you should put yourself in a position where you're abused. And he's not saying that if you're in a position where you're being abused that you should stay there. In fact, part of loving your enemy might be getting out of that whole situation. Part of loving your enemy very well mean that you never actually deal with them again. Okay? It does not mean that you wouldn't report what they're doing that's wrong. Okay? So if somebody is abusing you, and there's something that's been done that's wrong, it's okay to report that. It doesn't mean that you're sort of going to, you know, ignore abuse, that you're going to put up with physical, sexual, emotional abuse, but you're going to figure out healthy ways to deal with that. and in ways that you don't then turn around and do that to others, okay? So see, again, it's stopping because of this kingdom reality. But I'll tell you, sometimes those other pieces are very necessary. They're very, very necessary. Now, he gives great examples at the end of this chapter about people that, lived into a whole new reality, forgave others. And we talked about that a couple weeks ago too, right? Like, is God doing this stuff so that, somehow somebody would be blessed, but is it us? And this doesn't feel quite right to us. So we need good, healthy boundaries in these things also. He's really not saying just lay on the ground, be trampled. I mean, he's not saying, let them kill you, all this other kind of stuff. He's talking about ways that you can live into a whole new reality. And part of it is he's saying, don't let it push the old buttons in you that it used to push, okay? So part of this is maybe leaning into a new way of being. It could be saying, hey, listen, I'm willing to do this, but I'm really not willing to do this anymore because this has not been good for me and it's not been good for you, because there's a point in which somebody who is opposed to us, we don't help them by not saying anything either. But it doesn't mean that we retaliate in like manner. We find a new way of being in the midst of it. So we think of love as mushy, right? Because here he says, love is the greatest commandment of the kingdom. Love asks how we can help each other or help somebody else. So when we think about loving an enemy, we think about, well, what do we do that will help them feel better? But that's not really what he's saying. Love is also tough. Love has accountability in it. Sometimes loving an enemy may mean that, we provide the evidence that sends them to jail because, that's the place they need to go to really grapple with what's going on in their life. So you got to mix this in with truth-telling. It's not, sort of hiding the secrets, pretending like things didn't happen. It's another form of accountability. The same as forgiveness, and this is a whole nother lesson I'll talk about sometime, but a lot of times people think that forgiveness is sort of wishy-washy. If I forgive somebody, it's like saying what they did didn't matter. But that's not true. Actually, forgiveness is a form of accountability. Because if you've done something that has affected me so badly that I need to figure out how to forgive you, that means that you've done something that I've got to figure out what to do with. That's accountable. It's not ever saying what you did was okay. In fact, what it's saying is what you did is not okay. That's why I've got to figure out how to forgive you. Okay? Same thing with this, we're talking about loving an enemy. We're not saying let them tromp on you, do everything. We're saying, okay, so what does that mean? How do we live into a new reality of the fact that we have enemies, but we don't want to respond in kind in the way that they do? We want to live into this whole new reality. And part of that is he says that we got to put on the character of Christ. And I think that that's a place where, realize that we're not alone when it comes to facing those who oppose us, that God stands with us. Even when the whole world thinks that we've done things wrong, God knows what we've done right, and God knows the truth about situations, and we can live into that reality. When somebody does something like in the office or something, somebody takes credit for what you've done, you don't need to then look for a chance to take credit for what they've done. You can go talk to the person and say, I'm not going to say anything, or I am going to say something, or whatever, but I just want you to know that this isn't the kind of interactions I want to have. I mean, you can do positive things to try to bring about more accountability and a better way in the midst of that. He does say this. He says, to cross this bridge from selfishness and to generosity, he says, we need the power of the indwelling Christ. And I think that that's a really good thing for us to think about. There's a great quote on page 130. I'd invite you to look at it. And at the very top, it's the first or the second complete sentence. It says, God has an endless supply of resources, so the need to hang on to our possessions decreases. God is looking out for our needs, so we can take the time to go the extra mile. God is the real owner of all that we have, so the need to hoard and protect it all diminishes. Kingdom identity, I am the one in whom Christ dwells, and kingdom awareness, I am strong and secure in the kingdom of God, are the keys to doing what Jesus calls us to do. With these, we can learn how to become radically generous and how to live extraordinary lives. And so he ends this chapter by saying, live an extraordinary life. Be somebody who, by your life, can point to the reality of the kingdom of God in ways that help other people get caught up in that. And the way that we do that is by putting on the character of Christ. So may God bless you as you study this and as you look at it and think through it. But dare to live an extraordinary life. I like that phrase. This next week, then, we're looking at chapter 8, which is learning to live without vainglory. And another word for that is probably vanity or ego. The spiritual writers down through the ages have written tons of stuff on ego and how ego stands a lot of times between us and God. And we tend to focus on ourselves and lose focus on God. So as you read that, think about that. And the spiritual or the soul training exercise next week is secret service. It's doing something for somebody that you don't necessarily say, look, I did this for you, but just doing it out of the kindness of your heart. And I think that's an important thing for all of us because, it's interesting. There's a couple things that happen when we do that. When we don't tell somebody that we've done something, one of the things that happens is they wonder who did it. And so they actually get nicer to everybody because, you may be the person that did it for me, and I want to just be nice to you, And so anyway, it's really a fun sort of thing to do, and I'll try to share a couple stories next week. Well, actually, you're going to see the video next week, and I do share a couple stories on that. So, but anyway, blessings to you as you meet today. Yeah.